The end for Germany in North Africa was inevitable now. The Allies had overwhelming superiority. 6 times as many troops, 15 times as many tanks, more aircraft, more guns. Rommel, who'd been given overall command in Tunisia, had angered Hitler by saying that his forces should be evacuated and had been recalled to Berlin. And the flow of supplies had been virtually cut off by the Allied domination of the Mediterranean. It was a different story from the days in 1942, when the Luftwaffe and the U-boats had inflicted appalling losses on Allied convoys, and the British submarine flotilla operating from the besieged island of Malta had been withdrawn. By April 1943, the Axis forces, short of food, fuel and ammunition, were lodged in a final defensive arc 100 miles across. On May the 6th, a massive air and artillery bombardment on the Tunis-Bizerta sector destroyed the remaining German armour. The Allies drove into Tunis unopposed. At Enfidaville, the other half of von Arnim's army, stranded without fuel, was quickly surrounded. The Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered on May the 13th.
Yesterday afternoon at about 4:30, the war in North Africa came to an end. Early on Tuesday morning, the Axis armies were cut clean in half by the British drive across the neck of the Cape Bon Peninsula. That left mainly the German 90th Light Division to be accounted for, a division of tough, veteran fighting troops, some of the finest fighters that ever came out of Germany. In the mountains, they went on fighting until they had little ammunition left. Our troops in the north put down a smoke screen, and under cover of it they withdrew a little while our bombers went in 3 deadly waves to deliver the last aerial bombardment and one of the heaviest of the whole campaign. When our bombers had finished, our artillery opened up, and soon hundreds of white flags were appearing all over the place.
The Allies gathered for the invasion of Sicily, the biggest amphibious assault of the war, involving 500,000 men. Before it began, as Commander Anthony Kimmins saw, there was a brief moment for relaxation.
The days of exercising and preparation were over. What the men needed now was a chance to relax before the big moment. But North Africa, with its bomb-scarred ports and miles of sand and olive groves, hasn't much to offer in the way of distractions, except one thing: bathing. And so wherever possible, those camps were close to bathing beaches and the heavenly blue sea. On the eve of sailing, those long sandy beaches might have been Blackpool, Brighton or Coney Island, except that here there were no girls and no bathing suits. Just thousands and thousands of men, fighting fit, their bodies and legs of dark mahogany. In the harbour, the ships, ignoring the terrific heat, held a naval regatta. That's how your fighting men, your husbands, your sweethearts, your sons, behaved on the eve of the greatest invasion in history. As we rendezvoused at sea, our own force looked almost big enough to do the job by itself, escorting warships, big troop ships with their assault craft hanging on the davits, and literally hundreds of other landing craft steaming under their own power. Beyond the horizon there were other forces, some even larger than our own, approaching Sicily to arrive with us dead on 0 hour.
The assault on Sicily was made on July the 10th. Bad weather caused 50 of 140 British gliders sent in to take bridges and other installations to come down in the sea. But the weather also convinced the coastal defence units that the assault would not come that night. Sicily fell after 38 days of bloody fighting. The Allies entered Messina on August the 17th. Gary Marsh introduced General Patton.
2 minutes ago, the ceasefire was ordered. And here is General Patton, Commander-in-Chief of the American 7th Army, speaking to you from the hilltop overlooking Messina. Sir.
General Truscott, I appreciate very much your asking me to accompany you in entering the city which you have so gallantly captured. I cannot find words with which to express my admiration of your drive and enthusiasm, nor to express my appreciation of the magnificent fighting qualities and superhuman endurance of the soldiers of the 3rd Division. I certainly thank you and congratulate you again.
Frank Gillard found the little town of Lentini in festive mood.
This is the big social occasion of the week here in Lentini. These people clearly love their music, though incidentally they never seem to applaud very much. And their band is indeed a pretty good one. It's been playing pieces by Italian composers, Bellini and Verdi, and now it's come to the end of the programme. Since the first Sunday after our invasion, they've rounded their performance off with the British and American national anthems. They've done it quite spontaneously, as a gesture to show their friendship. And now we're about to record them as this Italian band in this little Sicilian town plays the anthems of two of the United Nations whose soldiers have come to liberate them. The conductor is waiting for a signal from me, so here we go.
The Allies' mood was victorious, but their failure to cut off the enemy's withdrawal at Messina, where 100,000 German and Italian troops with 10,000 vehicles, including tanks, crossed the straits to Italy, was to prolong the war in Italy. But the loss of Sicily and Allied bombing on the Italian mainland led to the fall of the Italian dictator Mussolini, who was put under house arrest in the Apennine Mountains. Marshal Badoglio, chosen by the Fascist General Council to replace him as premier, began secret negotiations for an armistice. On September the 8th, Badoglio announced the formal surrender of Italy, hours after the Allied invasion of Italy had begun.
Today, the 3rd of September, we enter the 5th year of the war. And today, the 8th Army, having fought its way from Egypt to Tunisia and then crossed the seas to Sicily, has landed on the mainland of the continent of Europe. We have a good plan and air support on a greater scale than we have ever had before. There can only be one end to this next battle, and that is another success. Forward to victory. Let us knock Italy out of the war.
It was a great deal more difficult than Monti's breezy words might have suggested, as the soldiers of the British Fifth Army found out at Salerno. They believed that Italy's surrender meant their landing by open assault craft would be unopposed. They ran into murderous fire. Hitler, doubting Italy's loyalty, had ordered Field Marshal Kesselring to occupy key installations as a precaution against his partner's possible betrayal. For 6 days, the British and Americans took heavy casualties on the beachheads and inland. Allied naval bombardment finally helped throw the Germans back. The port of Naples was secured. On October the 13th, the Italian government, which had fled from Rome to Brindisi, declared war on Germany.
This is the Home and Forces Programme. Here is the news, and this is Frederick Dreisewood reading it. 2 hours ago, Italy declared war on Germany. A proclamation by Marshal Badoglio brands the Germans for savagery against the civil population and says there can be no peace while a single German remains on Italian soil. Italy's new step has been acknowledged in London, Washington, and Moscow. Her status will be that of a co-belligerent, not an ally. The terms of the armistice with the Allied command remain in full force.
Kesselring fought a classic defensive campaign against a numerically stronger and better equipped enemy. The Allies painstakingly inched their way up the Italian peninsula. Kesselring had time to construct the Gustav Line, a fortified wall of concrete bunkers and minefields from coast to coast south of Rome. In December 1943, the leaders of the great powers met in Tehran to consider the wider picture of the war. It was the first conference of world leaders that Stalin agreed to attend.
The declaration by President Roosevelt, Mr. Churchill, and Premier Stalin, after last week's Tehran conferences, is published this evening. Military and diplomatic staffs were there, and common policy for war and peace was shaped and confirmed. Complete agreement was reached on the scope and timing of operations to be undertaken from the east, west, and south, with common understanding as a guarantee of victory.
The Germans continued to frustrate the Allies in Italy, fighting in bitter weather. In December, an unsuccessful attempt was made to break through the Gustav Line at Monte Cassino with heavy losses. In January 1944, a renewed offensive was launched, the Allies trying to bypass the line by landing troops north of it at Anzio. It was one of the notorious failures of the war. The simultaneous attack on Cassino had the desired result of engaging the German strength and drawing in the reserve troops. But at Anzio, the American commander of the Anglo-American force, General Lucas, failed to capitalize on his almost unopposed landing. Instead of striking inland, he chose to consolidate the beachhead. The German counter-offensive trapped the Allies where they were.
Hello, BBC. Winfred Vaughan Thomas speaking with Herbert Walden recording. That's the sounds of the first sounds of our own attack. And it's a sign that the usual night raid on our positions here is coming in. Right above us, the sky has suddenly become as bright as day. The German flares are burning, hanging almost motionless overhead in the night sky. And a shower of glittering silver lights coming down from them. Here on the ground, we feel as if we were standing under the flares on a fairground. Every tree, every house seems clearly lit up, and our old flak is getting furious and fierce. First bombs going down, it's away to the left of us, but even back here, the ground around is shaking viciously, and Walden's recording truck is now rocking on its springs.
Elsewhere, things were going badly for the Axis. On the Eastern Front, Soviet armies launched a new offensive at Leningrad, encircled 6 German divisions near Korsun, and were poised to cross into Romania. In the Pacific, the Americans had taken the Admiralty Islands and the Marshall Islands and knocked the Japanese naval base in the Truk Islands out of the war. Churchill again addressed the British people.
Since I spoke to you last, not only have the Han invaders been driven from the lands they had ravaged, but the guts of the German army have been largely torn out by Russian valor and generalship. The American victories in the Pacific, and in particular their latest conquest and liberation of the Marshall Islands, constitute superb examples of the combination of naval, air, and military force. When the signal is given, the whole circle of avenging nations will hurl themselves upon the foe and batter out the life of the cruelest tyranny which has ever sought to bar the progress of mankind.
For 4 months, on a beachhead 5 miles deep, the British and American forces at Anzio engaged in trench warfare, fighting desperately to save themselves from being overrun. They sustained 25,000 casualties. Their fortunes changed with the spring offensive against the Gustav Line.
It's spring here at Anzio, and under clear, warm skies, with the somehow unexpected sight of wild flowers carpeting the front line, we begin our 4th month ashore. Most people no longer live in foxholes. The men have used all the material to hand, with doors, beams from wrecked farms, and sometimes even steel girders, to get a solid roof over their heads. And the inevitable notices are appearing outside the front door. The better hole seems to be a favorite, with the addition, hawkers, bombs, and shells strictly prohibited. Still, the first prize goes to the Sergeant of the Army Kinematograph Unit, who's built a complete dugout cinema. He calls it the Anzio Ritz, seating 35 and emphatically no queuing. We've also had welcome visits from ENSA parties, and the men in one British division have formed their own concert party. And as the troops come out of the line, they have a hot shower and then a 2-hour show from the wagoners. The theaters are disused and bomb-cracked shed, and the costumes are all homemade, but I can tell you that no actors have a more appreciative audience. Well, the other grand spring attractions are the masked pipers of the beachhead, the beachhead rugby final, and for one afternoon only, a brigade point-to-point and a donkey derby. Our food standard is going up as well. We've got a bakery going, and the Americans have set up a donut factory. and there's one machine turning out donuts within 2 miles of the front line.
Monte Cassino, capped by its 6th century Benedictine monastery, was the pivotal point of the Gustav defences. 2,000 feet above the town, the Apennine Mountains soaring behind it, it was virtually impregnable. Massive bombing, which in February 1944 controversially destroyed the monastery, failed to dislodge the elite German 1st Parachute Division which held it. So did the US, New Zealand and Indian infantry who tried to scale its heights. In May, in a final effort, the Allied Commander-in-Chief, Alexander, threw 12 divisions, almost his entire strength, at the Cassino sector. On May the 14th, French and Moroccan troops breached the Gustav line to the west of Cassino, allowing an American advance near the coast towards Anzio, where a breakout was achieved. Monte Cassino was taken on May the 18th. The cost had been terrible. In all, 185,000 men died. Godfrey Talbot.
Now, as for today's taking of the great abbey of Monte Cassino on Monastery Hill, this was an enormously hard-won triumph for Polish troops against an enemy from whom they had suffered much. In the mountain heights through which the Poles broke to get round the back of the ruined monastery fortress, fighting had been severe in the extreme. Men fought till they dropped exhausted, or dropped killed or wounded. They had to get through appalling mountain tracks, with the Germans commanding them and pouring streams of fire upon them at every move. The Poles were counterattacked time after time when they gained a height, and there was, all the time, no way up to the hill positions except by mule and finally on foot. Always the supply, ammunition and water parties had to go up through heavy German fire. In many positions, you could by day remain alive only in a hole in the ground. To show yourself and move in daylight in these forward positions was death. I was at a Polish headquarters on the morning of the capture when the news came through. We're in the abbey. Monastery Hill is occupied. It was a historic moment, and the drama was heightened when an officer put the good news right in front of my eyes. He handed me a small piece of paper. "It's come from the monastery by one of our carrier pigeons," he said. And I looked at the crumpled scrap of paper. All that was on it was one large V for victory, drawn in pencil. And it was signed by a lieutenant of signals who had reached the abbey. The high wall of the abbey's west front was standing. Only that. The rest was just a pile of stones. That was all that remained of this famous religious house and seat of learning, in this, the last act of its 1400 years of history.
The road to Rome was now open, and on June the 5th the Allies marched into the city, the first European capital to be set free. The news swept almost everything else out of the BBC bulletins.
This is Godfrey Talbot, speaking from Rome. I'm standing in the middle of the Piazza Venezia on this day of our occupation, and at this moment the windows of the balcony of the Piazza Venezia, from which Mussolini used to make his speeches, the windows have been opened and has come out onto the balcony. Not Mussolini, who incidentally has never made any appearance on that balcony since July of last year, not Mussolini, but 3 Allied soldiers with their steel helmets on and their rifles in their hands. Beside them, 2 Romans, 2 people who've gone up from this square, 2 of the Italian people, and those 4 are standing there and they're waving the Italian and the Allied flags. A vastly different scene from the ones which that balcony has staged in the past.
Mussolini was now the puppet leader of German-occupied North Italy, installed by Hitler. He'd been snatched to safety by German paratroops in September 1943. In April 1945, he would be captured by partisans and shot, and his body hung by the ankles from the girders of a petrol station. 24 hours after the liberation of Rome, the world's attention was fixed elsewhere. The date was June the 6th, 1944. D-Day. Stalin had wanted Britain to open a second front in France from the time of the German invasion of Russia in 1941. Roosevelt also pressed. But after the disastrous amphibious assault on Dieppe in August 1942, in effect a rehearsal for D-Day in which nearly 3,500 Canadian troops died, Churchill was cautious. Even when the invasion was agreed, he feared another Dieppe, or worse, another Dunkirk. For days, the south of England knew that a big push was coming. 2 million men were on the move. Vehicles of every kind jammed the roads. The quaysides of the invasion ports were lined with supplies. On June the 4th, Frank Gillard reported,
England has become one vast ordnance dump and field park. In every wood and copse, in leafy dead-end lanes and side roads, often in private gardens, under quarries and embankments, there it all was. Trucks, ambulances, tanks, armoured cars, carriers, jeeps, bulldozers, ducks, vehicles of all kinds. Vast, really vast numbers of them. Right in the midst of it all, just as I'd turned for home, I passed a field where 22 men in khaki shirts and battle-dress trousers and heavy hobnail boots were having a quiet knock-up game of cricket. They made me think of Francis Drake and Plymouth Hoe.
General Eisenhower, the Allied Supreme Commander, had picked June the 5th for the invasion. Bad weather, which would have jeopardized the vital air support, postponed it for 24 hours, with the troops already aboard their cramped invasion craft. Robin Duff was with one ship.
All contact with the shore has ended. No one may come aboard, no one may go ashore. In Navy jargon, the ship and all of us aboard here are sealed. We're sealed because we've been told the answers to the questions that the whole world has been asking for 2 years and more. Where and how and when. Troops swarmed up the rope ladders last night. Strong, healthy, formidable men, many of them going into battle for the first time. As you walk along the decks, men are reading, or sleeping, or talking in small clusters. Across the water, we can hear the jazz from a minesweeper's gramophone.
The Allies had assembled the greatest armada ever seen. 5,300 ships, including 4,000 assault and ship-to-shore craft, 6 battleships, 22 cruisers, 93 destroyers. They had 11,500 planes. Nearly a third were bombers to pound the German defences. Another third were RAF and American fighters to keep the Luftwaffe at bay. Richard Dimbleby watched the first of the airborne troops take off.
The first aircraft that is going to lead the very front in the early hours of tomorrow morning is turning onto the end of the tarmac to make its takeoff. A graceful machine, and its wingtip light shining red and green over the heads of the dark, small figures of people on the aerodrome watching it take off. Taking off from here loaded with parachutists, and taking with it perhaps the hopes and the fears and the prayers of millions of people in this country who sleep tonight not knowing that this mighty operation is taking place. There she goes now, the first aircraft leading the attack on Europe.
Robin Duff in mid-channel reported,
In the wardroom, dinner. From the menu, soup, roast beef and green peas, and apples and cream. It might have been a crossing to Cherbourg in peacetime. And then you realized that your hand was moving just a little sluggishly to your mouth. Your tummy wasn't just where it usually was. The men around you were rather silent, and when they spoke, they were self-conscious. It was a room full of men on the way, wondering, waiting, and listening.
At 9:32 a.m. on Wednesday, June the 6th, the BBC broke into the Home Service to make an announcement.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is a special bulletin read by John Snagg. D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European fortress. The first official news came just after 9:30, when Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, usually called SHAPE from its initials, issued Communique Number 1. This said, under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces supported by strong air forces began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
Eisenhower broadcast to the peoples of occupied Europe, to whom the BBC's foreign language broadcasters had brought hope in the dark days of the occupation.
People of Western Europe, a landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe, made in conjunction with our great Russian allies. I have this message for all of you. Although the initial assault may not have been made in your own country, the hour of your liberation is approaching.
Hitler believed that the Allied attack would come in the Pas-de-Calais, thanks to the deception worked by Operation Fortitude. The Allies had created a fictitious army in the southeast of England, complete with fake tanks, artillery pieces and landing craft, backed by fake radio traffic that confirmed the army's existence. Meanwhile, the real invasion force was assembled in the south and west, the natural jumping-off ground for Normandy, which the invasion fleet approached as dawn was breaking. A handful of British four-man midget submarines, lying submerged only a few yards offshore, acted as beacons. As the troops went in, the reporters went with them. Colin Wills came ashore with the 2nd British Army, the Australian Chester Wilmot went in with the gliders, and the BBC's Guy Byam jumped with the paras.
All hands to beaching station.
This is the day and this is the hour. The sky is lightening over the coast of Europe as we go in. The sun is blazing down brightly now. It's almost like an omen, the way it suddenly come out just as we were going in. The whole sky is bright, the sea is a glittering mass of silver, with all these craft of every kind moving across it, and the great battleships in the background blazing away at the shore.
From where I am, standing between the two pilots of this glider, I can see the navigation lights of the tug in front of us, and off to left and right, the navigation lights of other tugs and other gliders bound on the same mission. Circling above from time to time, I can see the lights of the fighter screen, which is protecting us. And looking back down the glider, there are seated, although I can't see them in the half-light, officers and men, all laden up with equipment so heavily that they can barely walk. But they've got to carry with them the means by which they can fight the moment they land.
We're over the enemy coast now, and the run-in has started. 1 minute, 30 seconds, red light, green light, and out, get on, get out. Out fast into the cool night. Out into the air over France. And we know that the dropping zone is obstructed. We're jumping, in fact, into fields covered with poles. But I hit my chute and lower my kit bag, which suspends on the end of a 40-foot rope from my harness. And then the ground comes up to hit me, and I find myself in the middle of a cornfield.
As the day progressed, Alan Melville watched the Allied paras dropping in to support the beachhead, and Chester Wilmot watched more gliders follow him in, braving the German flak.
The paratroops are landing. They're landing all around me as I speak. They've come in from the sea, and they're fluttering down, red, white and blue parachutes fluttering down, and they're just about the best thing that we've seen for a good many hours. They're showering in. There's no other word for it.
It's just about 9 o'clock and a whole mass of gliders has just come in, having been towed across the channel from Britain. They've received a particularly severe welcome from the German Ack defences, and the flak has been going up from all around us. I can see about 4 or 5 coming in through the trees, skimming very low over the ploughed field and coming into touchdown. There'll barely be room for them.
By evening, the first wave of Normandy landings was complete. 75,000 troops had come ashore on the 5 beaches that were codenamed Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha and Utah. 23,000 troops had dropped by air. There were fewer than 6,000 casualties. The Americans lost most men, about 2,500 on Omaha, where the steep cliffs favoured the defenders' artillery. But the Allies' air supremacy was so great that it had 50 planes over the beaches for every one the Germans could put up. And the devastating firepower of the covering warships thwarted any German armoured counterattack. Hitler believed that Normandy was a diversion, that the invasion proper would come at Calais. A month later, he was still holding back 20 divisions. Montgomery had wanted a continuous front 10 miles inland by evening on D-Day. On Utah to the west, the Americans had barely gained a mile. He himself had barely established a position, and tanks, guns and transport were so snarled up that his infantry had to strike out towards Caen without armour support. They ran into a panzer division and became pinned down. Rommel, commander of the German Army Group B, had 2 other panzer divisions between the Loire and the Seine that he wanted to throw forward. At this point, the Allies were very vulnerable. Hitler refused for 2 days, by which time it was too late. During the days that the Allies fought to consolidate, the BBC was the only source of news dispatches to the world. Recordings made by all the Allied correspondents were ferried back by sea and air and censored in London. Germany already had tape recording, but throughout the war the BBC recorded on soft acetate discs, rather like gramophone records, which were easily damaged. Trucks were needed to carry the recording equipment, so the correspondents often couldn't record at the scene of the action. But the BBC's correspondents had gone to Normandy with new pieces of equipment, 40-pound portable recorders nicknamed midgets. Midgets were not always reliable, but they captured the very sounds of the struggle for Europe, the military and the human. For 6 weeks, the invasion of Normandy was a murderous battle of attrition. Montgomery was stalled at Caen, the Americans in the lanes and hedgerows. Frank Gillard reported lying flat in a cornfield.
I'm lying down at full length here in the cornfield. Just in the hedges around me, I can see many men taking shelter behind the banks wearing their steel helmets, while the terrific barrage goes on around us. In this barrage, we've got our 4.2-inch mortars, our field guns, our medium guns, all the guns of the fleet. The shells are whistling overhead now. Just listen to them.
Michael Standing and Alan Melville saw how French civilians were coping.
A bent old woman in a black shawl bids us good day. She stayed in bed through it all, she says, but the ceiling fell in on top of her, and now she's no habitable home. So much the worse, monsieur, but it can't be helped. A barber invites us in for a shave, and just at that moment the guns from one of our cruisers in the bay open up and shells go hurtling overhead. We think they might unsteady his hand. We decline politely.
The curé of this little Normandy church, 2 or 3 miles from Caen, wants me to say how sorry he is about these bells. His village has only just been liberated, and it's taken until yesterday to clean up the many German snipers left in hiding. When I asked the curé if we might record the bells of his church ringing in celebration of the village's freedom, he asked me to wait for a week. And this is why. They used to have a very lovely little carillon in this church. Only 3 bells, but they were very proud of it. And many of the villagers were expert bell ringers. But when the Allies freed the village, 3 German snipers hid in the square tower of the church. And for 2 nights they were very troublesome. At last they gave themselves up. But it was found that they had smashed the big bell of the carillon. Monsieur le Curé promised that if I would only wait a week, he would have the big bell repaired and you could hear the full carillon. But he added that in any case, they were going to ring the remaining 2 bells at once this morning to celebrate our coming. And I thought that you would rather hear the bells now, even though the big one has been smashed by the Germans, to let you know that the people of Normandy are celebrating their liberation, that church bells are ringing, and the villagers are going to Mass to give thanks for their freedom.
On June the 19th, the worst Channel storm for 40 years occurred. One of the 2 Mulberry artificial concrete harbours, which the Allies had towed over in sections, was smashed to pieces. The supply line was hampered. Nonetheless, men and equipment poured in as the panzer divisions shrank. Allied bombing and the activities of the Maquis delayed and harassed German reinforcements and even prevented them reaching the battle zone. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army destroyed an entire German army group in 12 days. 1/3 of a million Germans were killed, wounded or captured. With the German High Command needing to meet this catastrophe, the armies in Normandy could expect little further help. On July the 8th, the British took Caen. The American correspondent Bill Herbert witnessed the softening up by the RAF before the infantry went in.
Now, grey and purple smoke is billowing up from the Caen area. The results of this visual bombing attack are really terrific. Hundreds upon hundreds of pounds of bombs are raining down on this stricken town, and still the bombers come pouring in. There seems to be no end to them. This is an attack in a big way. The enemy is throwing up everything he has in the book, but he seems not able to get in any hits on our planes. Lots of near misses, but no telling shots. One bomber passing overhead has lost part of his tail assembly, so although the pilot is lower than the other planes in his flight, he's keeping her straight and steady on a homeward course. The whole target area is a seething mass of smoke. In the growing darkness, I can see the first dull red outline of the fire that is apparently raging in Caen. It'll be a big bonfire soon, and you can look for those words, "Big fires were left burning" in tomorrow's communique. Pilotless planes could never do a job like this, I'll bet. And now smoke is spreading over Caen, great clouds of it mushrooming upwards, and the flames are beginning to show an angry red color.
The German defence line had now been reduced to a thin crust, and on the 25th the Americans ended the stalemate by smashing through at Saint-Lô. The Allies raced forward. In the Falaise pocket, Hitler's Army Group B was shelled into obliteration. Rommel was seriously wounded. The July bomb plot to kill Hitler had already failed. Rommel, who was implicated, took poison. US and French troops landed in the south of France and dashed up the Rhone Valley to central France, scattering German resistance. The German Army Group G was swept off the map. At the end of August came the news that almost every Frenchman wanted to hear.
Here is the news, read by Richard Wessel. Paris has been liberated. A communique just received from General Koenig announces that it has been liberated by French forces of the interior.
Marvellous sights I've ever seen coming down the boulevards into the heart of Paris. Everywhere we went, people came running out of their houses, out of the shops, shaking hands with us. Children were held up to us to be kissed, and they clung around our necks. People were giving us flowers, tomatoes, everything. It's been the most marvellous procession I've ever seen. There they are, they're just mad with joy. Just listen to these crowds.
Robert Reed, who the following day recorded General de Gaulle's arrival at Notre Dame, where 40,000 people waited to greet him.
The general's now turned to face the square in this huge crowd of Parisians. He's being presented to people. He's being received. He's being received. Even while the general is marching into the cathedral. Well, that was one of the most dramatic scenes I've ever seen. Just as General de Gaulle was about to enter the Cathedral of Notre Dame, firing started all over the place. I'm afraid we couldn't get you the noise of that firing because I was overwhelmed by a rush of people who were trying to seek shelter, and my cable parted from my microphone. But I fell just near General de Gaulle, and I managed to pick myself up. General de Gaulle was trying to control the crowds rushing into the cathedral. He walked straight ahead into what appeared to me to be a hail of fire from somewhere inside the cathedral, somewhere from the galleries up near the vaulted roof. But he went straight ahead without hesitation, his shoulders flung back, and walked right down the central aisle, even while the bullets were pouring around him.
In the north, Montgomery raced into Belgium, covering 250 miles in 6 days. Chester Wilmot witnessed fierce German resistance to the armoured advance.
On the BBC, this is Chester Wilmot.
broadcasting from a street on the outskirts of Brussels. A street fight is just going on as we're coming into the outskirts of the city, and the tanks about 2 yards away from me are swinging their turrets round to fire out over the open fields towards a wood where we believe there are some Germans, because from that wood has been coming some fire. About 10 yards in front of me, there is an armoured car which has just been firing into the wood. That was the machine gun fire which you heard at the opening of this broadcast. Right along the column, the road is absolutely jam-packed with tanks, ambulances, jeeps, trucks, armoured cars, and every kind of vehicle as this column streams into Brussels. And for the moment it is halted by this fire on the left. Out in the field, civilians have flattened themselves down in the corn, and they're getting back behind the cover of the trees and the tanks. And now, from the tank columns, men are going out with Sten guns into the woods, hunting for the Boche.
On September the 3rd, Montgomery took Brussels. The port of Antwerp, of paramount importance to ease the Allies' extended supply line, fell to him. But in his eagerness to get to the Rhine before Patton, Montgomery failed to clear Antwerp's seaward access, the Scheldt estuary. It was several months before the port could be used. By the middle of September, the pace of pursuit was slowing down. The Germans had the strongest defensive positions since D-Day, the Siegfried and Maginot fortifications in the south, the canals and waterways of the Low Countries. The Allies tried to seize the initiative.
About 2 hours ago, Supreme Headquarters gave the news of our airborne landing in Holland in this brief announcement. Strong forces of the 1st Allied Airborne Army were landed in Holland this afternoon.
Ed Murrow was with the paratroopers and tried to count them as they jumped.
In just about 30 seconds now, our ship will drop, and these 19 men will walk out onto Dutch soil. You can probably hear the snap as they check the lashing on the static line. We're throttled back now. There it goes. Do you hear them shout? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. There they go. Every man out. I can see their chutes going down now. Every man clear. They're dropping just beside a little windmill near a church. Hanging there very gracefully. Seem to be completely relaxed, as I said a moment ago, like nothing so much as khaki dolls hanging beneath a green lampshade. You can see one man go down just north of the little road. The whole sky is filled with parachutes. They're all going down so slowly, it seems as though they should get to the ground much faster.
If the Allied gamble to seize the Dutch bridges had succeeded, the way would have been open for an armoured dash to the northern German plain before winter. It failed. The bridges at Nijmegen and Eindhoven were taken by the Americans, supported on the ground, but British and Polish airborne troops at Arnhem, furthest from the relieving army and virtually in the jaws of 2 panzer divisions, were almost overwhelmed. For 3 days they held the bridge, then they were driven from it and surrounded. Food and ammunition almost ran out. The RAF, as Stanley Maxted witnessed, managed a welcome airdrop.
Just a few minutes ago, the fighter cover showed up, and right behind them came those lovely supply planes that you can hear up above us now. Yesterday and this morning, our supplies came, and they were dropped in the wrong place. The enemy got them. But now these planes have come over, and they've dropped them right dead over us. Everybody is cheering and clapping, and they just can't give vent to their feelings about what a wonderful sight this is. All these bundles and parachuted packages and ammunition are coming down here all around us, through the trees, bouncing on the ground. The men are running out to get them, and you have no idea what this means to us to see this ammunition and this food coming down here where the men can get it.
The British Second Army struggled against fierce opposition to come to their rescue. For 10 days and nights the men of Arnhem fought on under concentrated fire. In the end, they had nothing left to fight with. Only 2,000 of the 9,000 who'd taken part in the operation got out. Maxted and a second BBC correspondent, Guy Byam, were among them. Byam, who swam the Neder Rhine holding the discs he'd recorded above his head, was to be killed in February 1945, flying with the 8th US Air Force on a daylight raid on Berlin.